From the time that I was very young, even as a small boy, I remember having a lot of fear and anxiety about money. There was something about money that made me afraid and uncertain. Later, when I grew up and started a family, I started to pray that God would send men into my life to teach me the truth about money that I did not know. That was when Ray Poteet and Nelson Nash came into my life, and I learned about the infinite banking concept. This whole company and this website and the podcast and the video series and everything is all about the love affair that I have been having with infinite banking since that time. So click the links, follow us on Instagram and Facebook, check out the podcast, check out the video course, and welcome to Duryea Financial. So glad you're here. Someone made the comment that if some authoritative power distributed all the money in the world equally among all the people in the world, that within 10 years, 97% of the money would be under control of 3% of the people again. Welcome back, guys. We're going to continue our book review of Nelson's book, Becoming Your Own Banker, and we're on page 11. That comment was just made by Nelson about if you actually could distribute the money evenly among everyone, that within 10 years we'd be right back to where we are now, which is 97% of the wealth being controlled by about 3% of the people. Nelson says, I suppose that there's no way to ever measure the validity of such a statement, but I have a feeling that it's probably true. Even if the proportions were somewhat moderated, why do you think that this phenomenon happens? Perhaps some of the answer lies in the fact that most people know next to nothing about the process of banking and its importance to their lives and their well-being. Banking is the most important business in the world. So just consider a simple thought for a moment. Nelson is saying, why is it that such a vast proportion of the world's wealth, probably over 95%, is controlled and owned by such a tiny number of people? Nelson's saying, what if it's banking? And what if it's not just banking? What if it's because nobody really understands how banking works? So again, this is not a book about life insurance. This is a book about banking. It's about how bankers think. In the previous episode, I was talking about this is a book about how we think, thoughts, specifically what kind of thinking. How does a banker think? That's what infinite banking is about. So what Nelson is going to start talking about is he's going to describe the banking system that we already have and get our mind in that place. And then he's going to take us over and say, if there's this banking system, what if we created a banking system that was different over here? Okay? So I'm going to do an aside here, and I'm going to step away from the book for a second, and I'm going to give you just a simple process or an illustration or a scenario to think about, and this is how bankers think. If you were to take $100,000, I don't care what the amount is, but we'll just use $100,000 as an easy number. If you took $100,000 and deposited it into a bank, is that deposit an asset or a liability to the bank? Now, most people would say that it's an asset to the bank, but stop and think for a minute. Isn't the entire asset owed to you, principal and interest? If a bank, if all they ever did was take deposits, and that was all they did, would they be making or losing money? They'd be losing money. The only cash flow they would have is they'd just be paying interest to depositors, and eventually you would demand the principal back, and all they've done is lost money. So what do they do with the money? Well, they loan it out to people. For, let's say somebody wants to buy a house. Now, if you've ever bought a house and gotten a mortgage, it's a little bit of paperwork, just a little. What it really says is you owe the whole thing to the bank. So is that mortgage that the bank created, is that mortgage an asset or a liability to the bank? It's an asset to the bank because the whole thing is owed to them, principal and interest. But is it an asset or a liability to you? It's a liability to you because you owe the whole thing to the bank. Now, here's all of the switch of thinking about how bankers think in one little scenario. Think about the deposit again. Isn't it strange that everything that we call an asset, the bank calls it a liability, the deposit. But everything we call a liability, the bank calls it an asset. But who's got all the money? The banks. So whose thinking needs to change? Ours. And that's really it's not just that bankers think differently, they think the exact opposite that we've been conditioned to think our whole lives. There's a famous video on YouTube that I strongly encourage you to go look at. We'll put the link in the description of the podcast, but it's called The Backwards Bicycle. It's a really famous viral YouTube video. And the guy in the video, he creates a bicycle where if you turn the handlebar to the right, the wheel turns left. And if you turn the handlebar left, the wheel turns to the right. So he calls it the backwards bicycle. And it took him 6 months to learn how to ride it. And he finally learned how, because all the micro adjustments and everything is the exact opposite to what you're used to. But he built one for his son, his 8-year-old son, and his son learned to ride it in like less than a week, because the neuroplasticity and the ability to just sponge things up when you're young is just off the charts. Learning to think like a banker financially is exactly like that. You have to learn to think about so many things backwards to the way that you've always thought about them in the past. So Nelson is saying, why is all the wealth controlled by such a tiny number of people? And his answer is banking. What if it's banking? And what if becoming our own banker would change the cash flow in our lives in ways that we don't expect? Banking, again, he says, banking is the most important business in the world. Without it, all business comes to a screeching halt. Not one single business in the entire world can operate without a bank, without banking involved. Whenever a business transaction takes place, money must flow from one party to another in a relatively short amount of time, or otherwise nothing takes place. That flow of money must come from a supply source, i.e., a reservoir. That is the essence of what the banking business is all about. Someone or some organization has control, i.e., ownership, of some pool of money that can and must flow at a cost to meet some need. What's he saying? He's saying it doesn't matter what's going on financially in business. He says there is always a reservoir of money. Think of your local water tower or the local water reservoir. A banker is someone who owns and controls the local city reservoir of not water, but money. And every single time that money flows from anyone to anyone, the banker gets paid. And Nelson is saying, what if we could learn to think like that? And what if the only thing stopping us from paying a banker every time we swipe our credit card, every time we write a check, every time we deposit money, every time we withdraw money, every time we take a loan, every time we make a loan payment, every single time in all of business, it doesn't matter if it's Microsoft or Google or Enron, Exxon, Enron, PNC, the biggest businesses in the world, or your local mom and pop hardware store. Every single time a financial transaction takes place, there is a banker who owns the reservoir of money that made that financial transaction possible, and that banker got paid to facilitate that. Nelson is saying, what if we reclaimed ownership and control of those reservoirs of money? And what if the only thing stopping us from doing that is the fact that we just don't know how to think that way? And what if the only reason that we don't know how to think that way is because nobody ever taught us to think that way? That's what this book is all about. This is what this concept is all about. Nelson goes on, there's only one pool of money in the world. This is an Austrian economics idea. The fact that this pool of money is managed by any number of institutions, banks, insurance companies, corporations, individuals in various countries and in various currency denominations is incidental. To argue otherwise would be the equivalent of someone looking at a globe and seeing the Amazon River in South America and that it flows into the Atlantic Ocean and commenting that this has nothing to do with the Indian Ocean on the other side of the globe. Nonsense. It's all the same pool of water. The banking business is like that. That's what Nelson is saying. Money flows from the pool through our hands to meet our needs, but somewhere in the process, it all ends up back in the banking system. It is all a matter of how much of the banking function do you control as it relates to your needs. How many of your financial banking transactions in your life, personally and business-wise, are owned and controlled by you versus some other banking system? This book is all about how you can create your own banking system so that you can control 100% of your needs, becoming your own banker. Give it your close attention, and it can make a radical improvement in your financial future. And then he ends this page with Jeremiah 29, verse 11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. So a simple question might be, how much hope in a future do we have if every bit of cash flow that we in our world is owned and controlled by some other banker rather than by us? God never intended for his people to be owned and controlled by the banks of the world. They're on their way out. Banking is being taken over by the people. And this is how. We need to we are taking the banking function back. Moving on to pages 12 and 13 in the book, How the Infinite Banking Concept Got Started. Nelson said that I started off as a forester, and then he said because of forestry, which is land, he got interested in real estate, the real estate business. Timber is a form of real estate as well as the land on which it grows. So I have been around real estate for all my working life, and I developed a strong interest in the subject of real estate, studying many books on it. If you read books on real estate, Nelson says, the central message you will find is not about real estate at all. It is about the magic of leverage. So he's saying, go read all those books about real estate. None of them are actually about real estate. They're all about leverage. Leverage is a banking term. Use this asset to borrow a bunch of money from the bank, use the cash flow from the asset to pay off the bank, and now you own this asset that was paid for by someone else's cash flow. Essentially, they all say, buy some real estate, borrow the money to pay for it, because you're always dealing with borrowed money. You either borrow money and pay interest, or you use your own money and give up the interest that you could have earned. I'll come back to that in a second. Pay interest for a while, and then sell the property. All you have given up is the interest. That leverage is wonderful. Amazing. And he says, this is all true as long as things are going the way that the financial geniuses describe it. But they never tell you what happens when the lever goes the wrong way, which is what happened to Nelson. He got into real estate investments, and he got into a particularly big one. The more that I learned about real estate, there was no logical reason not to expand. The interest rate at that time was 8%. And we must all pay 1.5% over prime because the bankers are not lending to you money because you have real estate. They are going to lend it to you because they think that you can make the payments. Why else would they acquire personal endorsement on the loan? You must renew the notes every 90 days at the current interest rate. I got accustomed to paying 9.5% interest, and that was just normal. Then along came 1981 and 1982. The prime rate rose and peaked at 21.5%, which means I had to pay 23%. If you watch his seminar, he describes it better in the seminar. He and two other guys bought a big property when the interest rates were only 8%. And so they were paying 9.5%. And he said it was a gorgeous property. It couldn't possibly go wrong. Well, guess what happened? One of the guys was a big-time lawyer. He bankrupted on them, so they had to eat his portion. And then the 90-day renewable notes went from 9.5% to 23% interest. Now, what Nelson used to say is, and it's here in the book, he says, when that kind of thing happens to you, it can improve the quality of your prayer life dramatically. And what it amounted to was $67,500 per year in additional interest that he hadn't planned on. So what happened to the leverage? The real estate was still the same quality of real estate, but the leverage bit him in the ass. During this time, a bunch of bandits broke into his home and burglarized their home. 2 months later after this, his 52-year-old brother dropped dead from a heart attack while playing racquetball with a son. Poor selection of ancestors. Our father died at age 64 from the same problem. And then 5 months later, their second granddaughter that was born in Hawaii developed a rare form of cancer. I didn't even know that babies could get cancer. A neuroblastoma. The lesions had involved her liver and she had to go on chemotherapy for several more treatments, but my story has a good part. She now is 25 years old and is cured. We have seen a miracle. Now for the bad financial news. It was the summer that the interest rates went to 23%, and there I stood owing $500,000 under those circumstances. When a number of bad things like this occur in a fairly rapid succession, it can increase the quality of your prayer life dramatically. The basic idea revealed in the infinite banking concept was born over a period of many, many months at between 3 and 4 a.m. in the kneeling position, praying, Lord, please show me a way out of this financial nightmare that I have created for myself. The answer came back like a baseball bat across the eyes. You are standing in the midst of everything it takes to get out, but you don't see it because you look at things like everyone else. You can get to the money during these awful times at 5% to 8% from 3 different life insurance companies through policies that you own. The only thing that limits how much you can get is the same thing that they tell you at the bank when you ask them how big of a check you can write. How much have you been putting in? So God showed him that when the rates at the bank were 23%, he could still borrow from the life insurance company at 5, 7, and 8%. And he used the equity he had at the life insurance company through his policies to get rid of that horrible 23% loan. And then he took the payments that he had been making to the bank and he made them to the life insurance policy loan instead. And when he did that, he experienced what we call the recapturing of the money. So this horrible experience he went through and this dark place that he went to actually gave birth to this incredible idea called the infinite banking concept. If you watch the memoir of his life that they created at the Nelson Institute on YouTube, you'll see that at that time, Nelson was so moved by this experience of the freedom of being able to borrow under his control, controlling the reservoir of leverage. I'm going to say that again. Controlling the reservoir of leverage, the banking function, that he started inviting people to, you've got to come to this. I'm putting on this seminar to describe what happened to me. You've got to come. And he said in the early days, back in the 80s, there were many times where the day before it happened, he would call all 40 or 50 people and everybody would say, oh yeah, we're going to be there. And not one single person showed up. He said that was really discouraging. But he persevered because of what had happened to him. Once it had happened to him, there was no going back. I have to share a personal story here for a minute about sharing infinite banking. At the beginning of the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, God speaks to the prophet Ezekiel and he says, go speak to my people Israel. And here's the message that I want you to speak to them. And by the way, they're not going to listen to you. The greatest speech I ever heard in my life about infinite banking was given by Carlos Lara at the think tank that they had in Las Vegas, I think 3 years ago. And he stood up and he told that story about Ezekiel. Carlos was one of Nelson's oldest friends. And he looked up at the room of, I think there was 450 advisors there, including myself. And he said, is that an assignment that you would accept? What we teach as infinite banking practitioners to the public is the complete opposite of everything else that everyone else out there is teaching them. And for us, we experience a vast amount of rejection. If you type in infinite banking on the internet, one of the first things that will come up is Dave Ramsey talking about, and the title of the video is Infinite Banking is a Scam. And I love that. The way that I know that something is one of the ways, it's not the only way, but one of the ways that I know that something is really worth standing for is if there is a camp of people that viciously oppose it. This was Jesus's experience. And so I often feel like the prophet Ezekiel sharing this with people and like, well, go, like I was telling my friend Matt today, God came to me and gave me this assignment. It was so clear. I would have given up if he hadn't. And it's like, go share this message. And a lot of times I feel like Ezekiel, they're not listening to me, God. Like, why should I keep sharing? But I keep sharing anyway because of what happened to me as well when this concept came into my life, like with Nelson. Nelson says, maybe you have found yourself in a financial prison like this. Or maybe you want to develop a system that will keep you out. Maybe yours is smaller than mine or greater. Whatever the size of the financial prison, the principles are the same and they will serve you well. It requires understanding and it requires discipline to implement the idea, but it can change your life dramatically, even beyond your fondest dreams. So what I tell people is everybody wants the results of going to the gym, but how many people will consistently go to the gym? That's what this whole podcast series is about, and that's what this book is all about. Consistently going to the gym to put our mind on the dumbbells, on the press, picking up the weights and teaching our mind to think differently. I'm going to close this podcast with this. I have been praying before the Lord and working for years to summarize what the primary benefit of the infinite banking concept is. And it's something like this. And I want to be able to say this as succinctly as possible. It changes the way that people think about everything, not just finances and investments, but so many things. Submitting ourselves to the discipline of thinking this way, that the way that Nelson's asking people to think, it activates brain muscles, like neurological muscles that have been dormant maybe for our whole lives. And the creativity and the sight and the understanding and the lifestyle that results is highly desirable. Again, like I've been saying this whole time, this is not about life insurance. And it's not even primarily, I mean, it is about how bankers think and how we think, but it really is about activating muscles in our mind that we've never used before to think in ways that we've never thought before, and the lifestyle that results from that. And the verse that ends this chapter is perfect, from Hosea 4, verse 6. And this was probably Ray's favorite verse. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests. And because you have ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. The principles of infinite banking is knowledge that all of us should have had from the time that we were children, and we didn't. And that's what motivates me to keep going. That's the entire motivation of this whole company, this whole website, all the content that we put out, the podcast and the video course, and every conversation that we have with people is to share this knowledge. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time.